Thank you, Patrick. Our next speaker is Juan Du. Juan is Dean of the John H. Daniels Faculty of Architecture, Landscape, and Design at the University of Toronto. She is the author of The Shenzhen Experiment, The Story of China's Instant City, and the founder of IDU Architects, a Hong Kong-based firm. She has practiced extensively in the US, Europe, and China, and has taught at the University of Hong Kong and at MIT. She has a PhD in architecture from ETH Zurich.
There was a jet lag of the slides. Okay. Thank you for the organizers for organizing such a fantastic group of people. It's been very dense in terms of information for me already. So I also want to thank the patience of those of you who's in the audience to listen to another, hopefully as stimulating, a 30-minute packet of what I think each of the talks today have been, could have been much longer. So this is a bit of an introduction, I think. So I am trained as an architect. I also participate in urban planning, urban policy, as well as other aspects. And I would just perhaps say that what informed my research on Shenzhen is as much based on academic research as much on lived experience and working in Shenzhen and Hong Kong for 2 decades. I recently just moved from Hong Kong recently, a year and a half ago. Pandemic years is kind of very foggy. I have moved a year and a half ago from Hong Kong back to North America. I grew up in the US and now I am teaching, as you can see, teaching and working in Toronto. So this is the first time I come to New York since I moved back to North America, so it's kind of a strange homecoming. And it's very interesting that I was telling Curtis that in the last year and a half, I've been so focused on crisis management in my school in Toronto that it's been a really wonderful day so far just to be able to think about the world out there, the greater world, and what is that we can all do to make it a little bit better. So is there any way for the light to be... It's pretty bright. Well, we'll see. Like those screens are actually much better. So you don't have to look at me. You can just look at those screens over there. So if there's things that you can't, it's a little bit better. Thank you. If there's things you cannot see here, I've noticed those large screens is a bit more. So Shenzhen has been mentioned quite often throughout today, as it was Hong Kong. And I'll try to, as this is my title, which is the Shenzhen Experiment, Demystifying China's Instant City. What I'll try to do is I'll try to demystify. I think it's okay. We don't want to put people to sleep. Didn't mean to. Oh, okay. All right. And you know there was no coffee at lunch. This would be perfect. Bedtime. Okay, this is just comic relief to wake everyone up because there was no coffee. Okay, perfect. Thank you so much for members doing this. So as I was saying, the Shenzhen and China and Hong Kong has been mentioned multiple times today. And I would say that as an architect, the only reason why I spent a decade writing a book is because I really wanted to demystify what is in China, but also outside of China, of what exactly has been some of the key principles to rapid urbanization and migration in China via a very specific example of Shenzhen. So we have seen a lot of data and large picture ideas, so I'm going to bring you to hopefully a more granular look at one city, which is the city Shenzhen, which is located in the Pearl River Delta. I know most of the people in this room are urbanists, so most of you would know about the Pearl River Delta. I don't have a pointer, but this is Hong Kong here, and that's Shenzhen. But this whole area, the population is about 120 million, and it generates, as of 3 years ago, a GDP of 1.8 trillion USD. Now, this is without Hong Kong and Macau. This is just the Pearl River Delta of mainland Chinese cities. So in this area alone, it generates 10% of China's total GDP. So it is today the largest metropolitan urbanized area in the world. Exceeded previously, I think, was Tokyo metropolitan area. I also appreciate some of the speakers throughout today making historical references, sometimes going back to decades and sometimes going back to centuries. I'm going to do a little bit of that too. So just to use a classic example of what has been called a miracle instant city of the US, Chicago. So Chicago, the year of 1870, had a population of 300,000. And by the 1900, it became a city of 1 million. William de Conan's Nature's Metropolis, it's a much more great book to discuss that history than me right now, but I just want to use this as a reference. So by 1950s, Chicago is 3.5 million. It has decreased in population since then. So it's just a little bit in comparison to Shenzhen. So Shenzhen in 1980 had a population of 300,000, contrary to a lot of myths. Shenzhen was not a small sleeping fishing village. It's 300,000 of 2,000 villages and historic townships. But the most important thing what I want to share here is that in the same time span that it took Chicago from 300,000 to 1 million, Shenzhen, in that same time span of 3 decades, went to 12 million. And then at that time, everyone thought this is it, that's the cap of it. And then it doubled in population within another decade. So it continued to attract people and reinvent itself. This is the image of Shenzhen that most of the, everyone would like for you to think this is what happens if you just add foreign direct investment plus tax plus a strong government. This is what you can get in 3 decades. Maybe, maybe not. I would say that the success of Shenzhen is actually not solely based on what has been perpetuated as the image of it, but actually these type of neighborhoods. I also saw the term urban village in your slide in there, in talking about India, new cities and special economic zones. I think someone else, the previous speaker was talking about Chandigarh. So the places that provided food in Chandigarh were urban villages. And those villages have been there for 800 years. So it's in the same way, Shenzhen. So these informal settlements, I would say that these are the informal settlements of Chinese cities, which is very little discussed within the context of China and more often in Latin America and Africa and India. And what's really wonderful about these informal settlements and neighborhoods in Shenzhen is that many of the streets look like this. There's they're very much mixed-use neighborhoods, and this street that I took a photograph, this street had been there since the Ming Dynasty. So since the Ming Dynasty, this street has been there for over a few hundred years. That today is still a very important neighborhood street. It's narrow because it used to be for horses and not for cars, so it was never planned and built for cars. So these are just little snapshots of what I have come to say is really the 4 largest misconceptions of Shenzhen, which in some ways is also synonymous with China's post-1978 economic reform and urbanization, because that's really the 3 decades that Shenzhen exploded in terms of its economic and population growth. And many of the policies that were experimented with in Shenzhen were indeed successfully implemented in the rest of the country in China. However, there are some very, I think, problematic misconceptions, and I generalize into purpose, time, people, and place. So misconception of purpose. Most often think the attribution of why the Chinese government under Deng Xiaoping in 1978, 1979 created a special economic zone was to create economic wealth and perpetuate China into a global powerhouse. That's not true, because at the time, in the late 1970s, China was in extreme poverty. It's unimaginable at that time for anyone in the world, including Deng Xiaoping himself and anyone within China, to think that in 3 decades, China could become one of the most wealthy countries in the world. I would say that the reason why a communist government under somewhat a progressive leader would even think about creating a special economic zone to experiment is because it had no other choice, because the country was in deep poverty. It just came out of 10 years of cultural revolution and famine. The country was dying. So it was either another revolution or trying something different. And that was the purpose. It was to create a zone as far from the capital as possible to experiment with something that the rest of the country could not imagine to be doing. So therefore, this area called Bao'an County, right north from the border of Hong Kong, was accepted to be a trial, a special economic zone. I say accepted because the whole idea of creating special economic zones in southern China did not come from Deng, did not come from Beijing. It was proposed from local governments locally in Guangdong, who went to Beijing, who asked for permission, said, could we try this? So it was already from the first moment very much a bottom-up proposal to Central that was granted. And what was granted was, okay, you can do it, but we have no money for you. So that's really important also. It's not that the Chinese state says, okay, we're going to do this, we'll give you everything you want. It was, okay, you can try it, we can't give you any help, you can do whatever you want, but if it doesn't work, we're going to shut you down. That was how it got started. So the intentions were quite different, I think, from what would later come to be justified, but I think that's a good news. It's good news to say that it wasn't a perfect state. It wasn't a wealthy area. There was so much constraints and so much uncertainties, a lot of poverty, unimaginable challenges, but yet it still succeeded. So Shenzhen actually was a city first before it was a special economic zone. And you can see that at first, the Shenzhen City Special Economic Zone was a smaller portion of the city. And this is the river this is the Luohu kind of checkpoint between, at that time, colonially ruled Hong Kong. Yes, it was a colony prior to 1979. We can talk about that perhaps later. Hong Kong did not have any form of self-democratic governance prior to the handover back to China. Voting rights of local Hong Kong residents only started to take place after 1979, not after it was no longer in British rule. But we can speak about that perhaps another occasion. But this is really important to know, that there were already a lot of these different aspects in the city, in the region, and the purpose to create Shenzhen was really almost like a last-ditch effort to try something different to save a nation. So it wasn't to create more money. It was simply to alleviate poverty. And I think that common and very basic action and that basic purpose is what allowed many people to suffer through challenges and create a mission impossible. And I like for just everyone to think about that when we're thinking about creating these things in other places and speaking with other governments and organizations. Misconception of time. So it's very often when people talk about Shenzhen, they start from the year 1978 or 1980. But Shenzhen, the site that later became Shenzhen City, was already a historic city for 2,000 years. This painting, it depicts 2 fort cities, actually, 2 walled cities, medieval cities in the region of Shenzhen. This is from the early Qing dynasty in China. And and you might say, well, yes, every site has a history, so why, it doesn't mean everything there is still there. So this is an example of one of those fort cities is this one. It was called Nantou Capital City or Nantou Walled City. And it was from this walled city that the entire Pearl River Delta was governed, including today Hong Kong and Macau. And it was a military center, a cultural center, an international trading center of the Maritime Silk Road. So it was very much a very active site of culture and art and commerce and international exchange. And today, it is called Nantou Historic City Urban Village. So this is probably one of a few examples of a city in the world that started as a capital city and today is a village. Rome, for example, is the other way around. And the photo I shared with you, I said that street was a few centuries old, that little market street. That's inside the city. Inside the city, but today is an urban village. So you see the red lines that's drawn. Those were historic streets inside this capital city that were planned for carriages and pedestrians. And even though the city wall has been demolished, was actually bombed during the Japanese occupation of this area, but you can still see the remnants of the urban pattern to the south of this modern city followed it. And to the north is you can see where trees didn't grow in this park because those were rammed earth. So the city and the land, the trees have a memory that's over 1,000 years old. So that's why I do think about, I heard a few speakers today spoke about this importance of plan with time, and I absolutely believe in that, and I support it. But for me, time should not be in terms of decades, should be in terms of centuries, both back and forward, if we're talking about true sustainability. Misconception of people, very often when people talk about Shenzhen, say, oh, it was only a small sleeping fishing village of 30,000. First of all, 30,000 is not a village, and also it's not true. So what was 30,000 was in the Shenzhen Old Market Town, which is right next to that checkpoint I showed you of Luohu. So Shenzhen, the term Shenzhen came from Shenzhen Old Market Town, and this term has been around for a few centuries. So when it became a city and special economic zone, they took that historic term of the old market town and expanded it for the whole thing. So a lot of times there was a misconception of exactly how old Shenzhen is. This is a map that was created by Italian missionaries based in Hong Kong, and they wanted to understand really the geography of Hong Kong, of then Hong Kong and Bao'an County, which was to the north. This is when the red parts of Hong Kong Island and Kowloon was conceded by the Qing Chinese government to the British government as colonies. But what I want to draw your attention to is that if you zoom in a little bit, you see where there's a red dots. I know Curtis, you're colorblind, but if you just see the density of text, so each red dot was either historic city, a historic town, or village. So this was this is a map that is 200 years old and really shows evidence of very much thriving, kind of urbanized set of relationships, even though it wasn't called, even though the large territory was not cities, there were historic towns that were cities and interconnected. This is a GIS mapping of the same, Shenzhen, and this was kind of in the middle of the urbanization history. I don't have the year here for some reason. This is 1992, where what you see in dark are the built-up areas, and what is yellow is urban villages. What that means is that land that the government did not take from the local villages. So they were left over almost as reservations, if you will, meaning the rest of the land were taking for urbanization and roads and infrastructure, but the yellow parts were still controlled by the urban villages, the original villages themselves. And that is very much a key to how these urban villages became to be so powerful in Shenzhen, because they were not taking away in the beginning. But this was not out of inclusivity or foresight. It was because when in 1979, 1980, the government had no money and they couldn't pay the villagers they could only pay them to kind of buy their agricultural land, but they didn't have funding to be able to build them homes, to give them jobs. They just said, we pay you this very low amount so you can turn your fishing ponds to us, but you can still keep your ancestral home, and you can have a little bit area so you can create your own businesses. And this is, after 1992, in the core city, the government took away all of the land and took away essentially from the villages, but still remained, see the urban villages on the outside. What I want you to notice something is that you notice how the dark areas, which is urbanized, kind of high density urbanization, they are always surrounding the yellow parts. Yeah? So this will give you, so this is a GIS mapping, GIS-based mapping that created into drawing. So most of the gray areas, meaning the unbuilt land, are mountain ranges. And many of the networks you'll see. But what you see is that this is a modern city of 20 million people where the modern urbanization pattern is precisely on top of and surrounding the original villages. So this is very much, this isn't rural to urban, this isn't, this is very much a hybrid of urban and rural, and this is very much where a city that grew multimodally around existing sites of economy, trade, culture, and people. So misconception of place, there's quite a lot of references to Shenzhen's origin as a fishing village, and I think I've already said earlier that's not the case. But that's really important because it really, that image that it was a village and then overnight it became a successful city through implementation plan of a master plan, right? This is Shenzhen's original master plan. In the master plan 1982 was when this master plan was released, 3 years after it had already become a city. So that is such a convincing story, a convincing myth. From a fishing village, we create a master plan, and then it became a successful city. That myth is so powerful, it really galvanized every single special economic zone built in China today and everywhere else being planned. But it's just not true. This was the master plan, and my interviews with the urban planners who created this master plan, the first thing they did is they mapped out area where they were not going to plan, because those were all of the urban villages, and they knew they couldn't afford to get it. The government couldn't afford to get it. So this is actually less so of a master plan, more so like where could they get land and to build things around it, and then to build networks around it. And when I mapped kind of in the same area, this is, so the green was orchids, farmed orchids for over centuries. All the blue you see on this mapping, they were fish ponds and shrimp ponds. They were kind of managed and cultivated land areas, and all the dark spots are the townships and villages. So you can see the correlations between, so this is my drawing over a CIA military survey map of Shenzhen in 1950. So this map that I created an analysis over is 30 years before this master plan. But there's strong correlations behind it to say, actually the original master plan, whether they wanted to admit it or were conscious of it, it actually very much worked with the geographies, local geographies, both human geographies and natural geographies of the land. And I would say that that's one of the reasons that it was successful, but that's very much overlooked in the later narrative. It's as if someone drew up something and put it there. And there's not a lot of photographs of Shenzhen during the first decade of urbanization because everyone was really busy and poor. At this time, there were actually only 5 telephone lines in the city. So it was very much the early startup of people just trying to build. But the most dense and popular areas during the first decade, this is in the foreground right here, as they were trying to build the towers and the roads, it's the urban villages. So in the urban villages is where you found food and shelter and water and restaurants and someone to talk to. So it very much was very, very important. Otherwise, the city had no human infrastructure, right? You just have roads and buildings, but what else could you do? And this, at the same time, this rapid urbanization, whether the public governments or the private companies that was building the roads and buildings, none of them could keep up the demand of creating housing fast enough for these workers coming in. So the urban villagers themselves started to build rental homes. So what they did is they demolished their own historic kind of house, and they built it into 2 stories, 3 stories, later 6 stories, and now there's 12 stories with elevators. So essentially all of the urban villages each individual urban villager started building housing for themselves, but also for these people who were coming into the city. So that started from the very first few years of the city. So today, out of 20 million people, even today, 10 million people lives in urban villages of this modern city. So it is very much, that's why I said it has very much been an important actor and agent and along to create what the city is today. And that might be unmanageable for many reasons, but that simply was and is the case. So this is a map just to give you, this is an aerial photo of what kind of one of those neighborhoods look like. And you can see big golf course, big roads. This is the theme park, China's first theme park called Windows to the World. But you see these smaller, so these are modern buildings, skyscrapers. These are the smaller granular. Someone was talking about plot sizes. You can see the differences of plot sizes in the city. And when you zoom in, they look like this. And when you zoom in further, they look like this. They actually look like small Italian townships when I first walked into them. And it's in these neighborhoods where the majority of the migrant workers come in and really has made the city into their home. I also want to have a note about migrants and migrant workers. So Shenzhen had a population of 300,000. And then it was 10 million, 20 million, 30 million. So everyone in Shenzhen is a migrant, from the mayor on to these kids playing basketball. So it's very much, I would say, the world's ultimate migration city. That all happened in 2-3 decades. And keep in mind that a young kid who may be working in a factory 20 years ago, today could be one of the most wealthy individual owning multi-billion-dollar companies in Shenzhen. And that is what happened, is that these urban villages became points of arrival. So yes, they were low income when they arrived, but these neighborhoods allow them accessibility and economic mobility for them to become major players in the city and contributing not only to municipal wealth, but national wealth and international wealth as well. So in these kind of images that you see of the city, the misinterpretations of purpose, time, people, and place gives reason to believe that the Chinese city, the contemporary Chinese city, as modeled by Shenzhen, shows the excess of authoritarian governance, cultural disruption, like there was nothing before and now it's there, exclusive communities, because you just see the wealth, top-down planning, because that's what people say, that's what made it successful, controlled economy, right? It's still communist. Rural-urban divide, right? The rural was the past and port, and here signing new and urban. But actually, Shenzhen, I think, examined at a granular scale with sensitivity and understanding the bigger aspect actually shows the success of collaborative governance when actually the governance and rule is given to local authority, local agencies, and local communities rather than being centralized. Cultural continuity of the old and the new, inclusive communities where it is very much, most of the neighborhoods were mixed income, flexible planning, informal economy, having, I would say, probably the largest contribution to Shenzhen's economy than the formal economy, and rural-urban continuum, rather than somehow there was a moment that it was rural and now it's urban. And I think that I believe that these are the key that we should be looking at and focusing on, because I actually do believe that there's a lot we can learn from a city such as Shenzhen that could be applicable, and those learnings I would propose is in these areas. So most of this, not all, but most of this is in my book that was published in the middle of the pandemic. It's called The Shenzhen Experiment, The Story of China's Instant City. I want to just share a little bit on perhaps why I'm arriving at a very different narrative and different thesis than most other researchers or planners on Shenzhen. One is because I lived and worked there for almost 2 decades. The other one is that I'm much more comfortable in English. I moved from China to the US when I was 10, but I did make sure I read everything I could. I would publish in Chinese in the past like 500 years on Shenzhen, because I really wanted to understand it from that perspective. So I was very careful with how much resources I could cite in my book. So out of 475 citations, I cited the majority was Chinese materials. So I was very, very careful. So I only cited representative English publications, and rather instead citing things that actually were never cited either by academics, either in English or in Chinese. And I would say that being able to draw the source historically and locally did give me evidence that were different from what was previously constantly cited as both evidence and history. That plus a somewhat an unusual path for me is that I am a practitioner as well as an academic. So many of what went in the book and the people that you will encounter should you like to read the book are individuals I had worked with for over 10, 15 years. So that I really had the honor to be able to learn directly from them, essentially kind of immediate oral history of their lives as they lived in it. And this is the inside cover of the Shenzhen Experiment book, just for me to really make that thesis that I'm not sure if you can instantly create a city. I think that there's much we can learn from how to more carefully contribute to policy and planning of extreme rapid urban growth and urban expansion. But there's as much as we can learn from history and culture and art and literature and people as we can learn from data. So thank you very much.